I'm Rebecca Seitz, and this is Right to Life. After the crazy ride of the last episode, my hope was to find someone we could talk with who also considers themselves to be a Christian and pro-life, but maybe is a bit more versed in the issue of this show, abortion, and the morality thereof. Earlier this week, I turned on the documentary Bad Faith via Amazon Prime. Now, I have to admit, I rarely watch the docs about how politics and evangelicalism became so intertwined because they remind me of my childhood and adulthood through age 38, and that doesn't always bring up particularly positive memories. Leaving evangelicalism is very difficult when it's your entire life. And some of my wounds are still scarring themselves over even today, 8 years later. But I felt drawn to this film, so I watched it. And I'm glad I did. It took an informational approach to the subject. And you can probably guess how much I appreciate that. One of the experts in the film is Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove, a Southern Baptist pastor based in North Carolina. I reached out to him, explained the journey that we're on with this show, and I asked if he'd be willing to talk with us from his perspective. Well, Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove, thank you so much for coming on the Right to Life show.
I'm glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate that you responded to me. When I saw you in the Bad Faith documentary, I thought I would just love to be able to speak to that person on this show about this issue. And so I was very, very excited that you responded to me. I know we're coming up on time to vote here. Some people here in the state have already voted, early voted, but I felt like there was more to say. And so I wanted to talk with you about this issue. But before we get into that, if you can just, for those who aren't familiar with your books and your background, could you let us know what is your educational background and your publication background?
Well, I grew up in the Baptist church in North Carolina. My education and formation is primarily there. I was raised by people who taught me to love the Bible and called me to be a preacher when I was 16 years old. So I've been doing that ever since. I went to Eastern Baptist College outside of Philadelphia, where my friend and mentor, Tony Campolo, taught for over 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then went to Duke Divinity School here in my home state of North Carolina, a school started by the Methodists, but friendly enough with the Baptists to let me in. So I now teach at Yale Divinity School, where we started a Center for Public Theology and Public Policy just a couple years ago.
And you've written so much. I'm familiar with Revolution of Values, Reconstructing the Gospel, and then your Common Prayer, a liturgy for for ordinary radicals. That was
good,
cool.
Good to be praying with you. Yes.
But I did not know until actually I was prepping to talk to you today. I didn't know that you were on the Third Reconstruction book with Reverend Barber. I didn't realize that you had been a part of that.
Well, Reverend William Barber helped me find my way as a young Baptist who had been kind of recruited into a political movement that was reaching out to young people of faith when I was young. And I recognized that really wasn't the fullness of what the gospel had to offer in terms of our faithful response to public life. But I didn't know any other way to be Christian outside of the kind of narrow confines of what I had grown up in. So Reverend Barber introduced me to what he calls moral fusion politics, or, the long history of people who have preached Jesus and justice in America from the abolitionist movement up to the present. And he had grown up in that tradition. So we've been close friends and colleagues since. And we write a lot together. We wrote the Third Reconstruction together. We recently wrote a book called White Poverty together, and our work closely at Repairers of the Breach, which is an organization we started really to address this division that has been sown by people who often use Christian faith, but who are primarily serving the interests of a very small and elite group of people in this country. So they've given them a lot of money to create divisions that they think help them.
And that we're
I'm not sure that it
contending
helps
with, I
anybody,
think.
but anyway, that's their motivation.
Hmm. You said that you said in there that you were being recruited to be a part of, I think, what has led to what we're all living in now, which is a very divided nation.
Yeah.
What is that? What did that look like when you were a younger pastor, a young man?
Well, a political operative named Paul Weyrich was very active in the late 70s and 80s in using what he called traditional and biblical values to try to bring white, initially largely white Southern Christians into a coalition that would vote together. And toward that end, they developed a lot of leadership development programs and free literature and things like this, podcasts and radio shows and other things that essentially created a culture where people came to adopt their language about many issues. And of course, in the beginning it was all about the language they used of being pro-life. So that really was the initial issue that Weyrich decided to organize around in order to recruit people for his political movement.
Do you know why he chose abortion as the issue?
Yes, actually, Randall Balmer, the historian, I think has written a good book about just that question. It's a book called Bad Faith. It's where they got the name for that movie
The
that you
name.
mentioned. But he went back and looked closely as a historian at the conversations that were happening in communities and the decisions that these political operatives made as they were establishing this movement. And his read, and I think he's right, is that the primary reason the movement decided to focus on abortion was because they recognized it as an issue that they could use to appeal to people who had actually been politicized by race issues, in particular by their objection to the federal government cracking down on churches that started segregation academies in the South.
So, like Bob Jones University, Liberty.
Yeah, well, those are the kind of those are the big versions of it, but a lot of smaller churches had in places, and this is actually how Jerry Falwell got his start in Virginia. So when the Brown decision passed, 1954 decision, in which the Supreme Court said that separate but equal wasn't equal, couldn't be equal, and so it wasn't constitutional, they then ordered schools to desegregate, as they said, with all deliberate speed. Back then, there was a Baptist preacher named Clarence Jordan who said, "Nothing makes Southerners madder than telling them they better hurry up."
That is a true statement. That is a true statement.
There was a really a backlash against that decision by the court. And in Virginia, where Jerry Falwell was a Baptist preacher, that looked like what they called they established what they called state sovereignty commissions. So it's the kind of like states' rights idea.
Oh my.
But
Okay.
then said that their movement was called massive resistance. So they said, we will resist this to the point of shutting down our public schools rather than allow our children to go to school. These are white folks saying, rather than have white children go to school with black children. And well, of course, they did that. They did shut down the schools in Virginia for a short time. And then people got kind of like during COVID, people got tired of having their kids at home and said, we got to send them somewhere.
That happens.
And the alternative in many cases was that churches opened. So these would be grade schools in the church. So this is actually the foundation of many private Christian academies in the South that are connected to churches. And those schools were then all white schools for the white children who went to them. Well, the IRS came in and said, if you're going to have nonprofit status granted by the federal government, but then defy the federal government's order to desegregate schools, then you'll lose your nonprofit status. And that was what Weyrich recognized was an opportunity to organize white Christians in the South politically. But he knew by the 70s that having an explicitly racist movement wasn't going to be politically acceptable. So he was looking for another issue to organize people around. What Balmer documents is that he identified abortion as that issue, and then he went to people like Falwell, who had already been politicized by the race issues, and convinced them to get on board. So Balmer, traces that it was 5 years after the Roe decision that Falwell preached his first sermon against abortion. Which, if it was a strong moral issue, which is what he always said it was after that issue, you have to ask, why'd you wait 5 years?
Right,
But
right. Why were you not telling everybody right? I mean, because I think we can look at the decisions that are coming down from the Supreme Court today, and as soon as a decision comes down, preachers are preaching on it, one way or the other. And so the idea that the Supreme Court would have handed down Roe, the original Roe, and preachers would have thought that it was the major issue that it is today in pulpits and not say anything for 5 years just doesn't wash. So,
well, and it's because there was no Baptist tradition of resisting abortion. I mean, abortion's not new, right?
mhm,
And it wasn't like a new thing, a new issue when Roe came along. The politics, of course, changed, but it wasn't that people hadn't thought about this before. But there simply wasn't a Baptist tradition. There were Baptists who were probably for and against it. There were. I mean, you can read folks who said both beforehand, but there was no Baptist tradition that taught that there's a particular point when life begins in the womb, or that there's any kind of there are no traditions around. But what the things people talk about today, ensoulment, or
mhm.
when a person is fully a person. I mean, these are complex and I think frankly unknowable things in many cases. But at any rate, Baptists didn't have a tradition to really tap into. So these folks had to create one, and they create. I think the important point is that they created it to serve a political end.
So is that the point, or was there a different point that if you look back on it now, we could look at it and say, okay, that is the point where that was the tipping point of prior to that, our faith and our politics were two different parts of our lives. And at that point, they started running at least parallel, if not starting to weave themselves together to the point that now, for many, they're they're so intertwined it feels as if you would blow up your life to remove one from the other. They're a single identity. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I know what you mean. I'm not sure that we can break it down that simply. I think the historical point that we're talking about is when it became about abortion. But I
Mm.
think any honest reading of Southern Baptist churches in the 50s and 60s would have to say that yes, faith and politics were very closely connected, and that it was all about race. A lot of
True.
white
So,
Baptist churches were organized around defending what they understood to be their racial hierarchy and understanding of how the world work, which is not a proud history, but I think to be
mhm.
honest is to say that was there.
So in the same way, what does it look like? I know what it looks like in my own personal life when I started separating, trying to find truth and wisdom on issues separate from what I was being taught within
Mhm.
the Southern Baptist tradition, because the two were not in alignment in many ways, including in my worldview on the abortion issue. And I started learning about, oh, well, this is how it became what it
Mhm.
became in the Southern Baptist tradition. What does it look like then for somebody who was like me today? I started separating from my evangelical tradition in 2016. So I'm 8 years removed. Looking at it in 2024, because I'm sure you're seeing this every day. I'm not here in my little media company. How does someone even go about today if they're every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night sitting in an evangelical pew listening to this kind of rhetoric of there's no way that you can love Jesus and be pro-choice? How does that thought process begin and move? What does that life look like if you are of the mind? I know a lot of people that are listening to the show, and I know because they're feeding it back to me, are going, wait a minute, maybe I haven't gotten this right.
Yeah.
How do you keep your faith intact and separate yourself from that political rhetoric?
Yeah, that's a
Small
great
question,
question.
tiny little question for
It's
you.
a great question, and it's one that a lot of people are grappling with because I guess what I want to say is that the reason I don't think we can too simply sort of draw historical lines of a kind of before and after. For the same reason, I don't think we can draw simple lines in terms of places where, these things are clearly mixed and where they're not, because people often talk about white evangelicals as, thinking this or that. And it is true that surveys consistently show that a greater percentage of white evangelicals would be anti-abortion than white mainline Protestants. It's not actually that much different with white Catholics, but nevertheless, like that's like you can talk about it in terms of percentages, but it's not the case that this is a sort of universal thing in any church, right? And I think that's an important thing for people to know, that these are not doctrinal commitments of the church. This is a culture that churches have certainly participated in, and frankly, that lots of people outside of churches have pushed to build up and to create kind of norms around within churches. But I don't think it's true that everybody in churches agrees about these things. And I think it's important for people inside of a church where they feel like everyone assumes that to be Christian is necessarily to be anti-abortion. Even to be pro-life is to be anti-abortion. I don't think that hasn't historically always been the case. I don't think it is now. I just think that an incredible amount of money has been invested in sort of norming that narrative, particularly among white Christians in the South.
So do you think, with your educational background, and you're a pastor, is there a moral position where it is the moral thing to allow abortion?
Sure. There are lots of moral traditions that include the option of, a woman deciding with her doctor's advice and, with her family that, yeah, that an abortion is the best possible option in that situation. We often get, kind of extreme cases, right, where they'll say, well, there should be exceptions for rape and incest. I think people can imagine those situations. But I mean, I just think I'm a father, if I've never been pregnant myself, but and married to someone who has been
Haven't
married
had
to
that
someone who's been
experience,
pregnant,
have
and
you?
have certainly pastored a lot of people who've been pregnant. And I just know enough from being there with people at the beginning of pregnancies, with people, when they get all kinds of medical news, being in the birthing room, that these are very complicated situations. Welcoming life into the world is not a simple thing, is what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's quite a bit of mystery in terms of life as a gift. Absolutely. Every life is a gift. And I consider myself to be pro-life, but I don't think being pro-life means being anti-abortion in every situation, because there are moments when, you have to make incredibly difficult decisions in terms of, what is it going to mean to preserve the life of this mother, to preserve the life of this family, given, the situation that they're in. And that's,
Mm-hmm.
and I just think that women having options, in terms of the reproductive health care that they need at the moment is the most important thing for promoting life. And I often, when I'm talking to folks about this, because I respect people, especially Roman Catholics who understand it as a doctrinal point in their church, that life begins at conception. They're taught this. I'm a Baptist. That's not exactly how I see it, but I understand that that's how they see it. I respect people who say, I would never want to terminate a pregnancy. And even that, I want to counsel other, women in my faith tradition not to do that. I can respect that, but also say that, we live in a pluralistic democracy where people have different understandings. And even if your goal in life is to reduce abortions, I think it is important to note that if you look over the life of Roe under Republican and Democratic presidents, that when Democrats were in office, there tended to be more access to health care. And so the numbers of abortions actually went down
Mm-hmm.
under Democrat presidents for the last several decades, whereas under Republicans, it would go up, because the people who have the hardest decisions to make, we're having to make them with the least resources. So I really do think it's often an issue of access to healthcare, access to the basic necessities of life, and that people who are pro-life and want to serve life, which I think fundamentally, not just the Christian faith, but all moral traditions point us toward, we are here to serve life. I think there are ways to do that don't mean you need to be anti-abortion.
So let me ask you this question. I had a woman who was talking to me about this issue from having listened to the show, and she raised in the same tradition I was. She's struggling a little bit because it is very the stat that you just mentioned about there being fewer abortions when there's a Democrat in the White House was the first stat that I became aware of, that I went, oh, well, maybe I don't know what I think I know about this issue.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what made me start digging into what if my goal is to actually protect and nurture life. Let me set the political rhetoric aside. Let me set what I've been taught or the talking points aside and really dig into this. What can I actually do as an individual with my behaviors and my choices that actually is going to protect and nurture life? Let's just set aside political parties and all that stuff for a second and get to the root of it. And it was because of that stat. I was like, whoa, that doesn't jive with what I thought I knew. But this woman was talking to me, and I felt for her because I remember the days when I was first learning, and it's so jarring to think. It makes you question everything that you've ever thought that you knew, and that is an incredibly difficult position to be in because it feels like your world is crumbling because you thought you had it all figured out, and you knew how to be right, and you knew how to be wrong, and you knew how to please God, and you knew how to upset God, and now you realize maybe not. And she said to me, her main concern, I'm not going to get the quote quite right, but her main concern was, she said, well, if I believe what I'm learning by listening to Right to Life, and I go in there and I vote yes on this amendment, which will allow abortion to be accessible to women in the state of Florida up to the point of fetal viability, which is around 22, 23 weeks. And I'm wrong, I have to answer for that when I face God in the next life.
Mm-hmm.
And what will I say to him? What am I going to say to God? And I had answers for her, of course, because I've had to wrestle with it myself. But as a pastor, what's the pastoral answer to that?
Well, the first thing is that I think you're asking a morally serious question. So I wouldn't dismiss it by any means. This is a morally serious question. Life is precious, and to have to grapple with what we do to cultivate and welcome life and sustain life. I mean, these are fundamental moral issues. I think it's possible, even for people who, for their own issues of conscience and even in their own religious traditions, who would not support abortion, to support a political system in which people do have the freedom to make the decisions that they believe are right and to take political action and vote and other things for issues that would sustain life. And I think we can, the basic notion of a democracy is that we believe that even though we don't all have the same frameworks or understandings of what is right in public life, that we can give each person an equal voice and argue it out in a way that we agree to live peaceably together. That seems to me to be greatly contested in the present moment, but nevertheless is a tradition. Again, as a Baptist, I respect and want to lean into. I actually think, freedom of conscience in the Christian tradition had a lot to do with why we decided to have a separation of church and state and the pursuit of a kind of democracy where, there's an equal opportunity to have your voice heard, but that, the majority will is going to decide the direction of policy at any given moment. That's allowing a great deal of freedom to people that you disagree with, but nevertheless, I think it's the greatest chance we have of living peaceably together.
I've thought about that as well. To me, at the core of trying to restrict abortion or outlaw it altogether, the core motivation at play is someone saying, I have made a decision about whether or not abortion can ever be moral. I have decided that every single time it is immoral, so it should never be allowed. Conversation over. That's it. We're making this the law. And while we have plenty of laws that absolutely would abide by that logic, this particular issue, as you've alluded to several times, of when does life begin? That's a question that different people answer differently, depending on if they're answering from a point of science or a point of any particular religious faith or no particular religious faith.
Yeah.
So that hasn't been decided. When should, the life in the womb be able to be terminated and when should it not? When is it a loss and when is it not? These are all questions still.
Yeah.
And so it strikes me that in
Well,
faith
real
tradition.
quickly, since your listeners, may have heard a lot of the answers that have been developed over the past 40 years on that,
Mhm.
I think it's worth just pointing out, in case you haven't been exposed to others, that the much longer biblical tradition, of course, is that life begins when you take your first breath, because the creation story is God breathing life into Adam, the human being, and so people who knew that story and knew it as a kind of fundamental imagination for what life means, where we find meaning in life. In the Jewish tradition, that was always understood to be, well, that's when life begins, which
Mm.
is why abortion has had a place in Jewish tradition for a long, long time.
Mhm.
So anyway, when people talk about traditional values, I think it's important to know that there's a long tradition
There,
of reading the Bible that
there
way.
is. Okay, so I have one final question for you. In keeping with this new tradition that popped up in the 70s and 80s, late 70s, early 80s, about the moral majority and all of that and Paul Weirich's idea of let's legislate, let's enact into law our values from an evangelical Christian perspective. That's what we're going to make the law. That's our goal.
Yeah.
Is that biblical to do that? Is that even Christian to do that? Do we have a responsibility to know our values, base them in our religious tradition, and enact those traditions into law? Is that the goal?
Is it Christian? Let's say this. If you know the history of the church, there are Christians that have tried to do that at many times in Christian history. I happen to be descended from people who became Baptist because the Puritans were trying to do that in Massachusetts, right? I mean that's why Roger
Wow.
Williams that's why Roger Williams started Rhode Island, because Puritans had a certain vision of what they thought, a theocratic order should be, and they imposed it on everyone in Massachusetts. And Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson and others who read the Bible, believed in Jesus, but interpreted it all very differently, said, we believe in freedom of conscience. We believe that people have the freedom to choose how they want to worship God and when and where. And actually, they argued for, well, that tradition argued for the religious liberty that's part of the First Amendment, to the Constitution. So there were very different ways that religion and public life had been negotiated. When they all came together and decided to form these United States, part of the discussion at the Constitutional Congress was what sort of what sort of public faith were we going to have, and the agreement that the United States would be a kind of religiously pluralistic setting where there's a separation between church and state, not to protect the state from the church, but rather to protect the church from the state. And that's Roger Williams' whole image, is of the hedge around an English garden was the image he used, so that you don't put up the hedge to sort of protect the wilderness. You put the hedge up to protect the garden, right? To keep the sort of weeds and such from outside coming in. The authenticity of faith was what he wanted to protect. And so in order to do that, people have a certain political freedom. Now, again, I granted that other people interpret that differently, but for me, and in terms of how I understand who we are as people and who God created us to be, I think that freedom is actually an essential gift of what it means to be human. I read the creation story as God giving humans the gift of life and then giving us the gift of freedom, right? That we can choose to live the good life that God offers us, the life that, Jesus calls eternal life, the kind of life that can go on forever. We have the freedom to choose that, but God also gives us the freedom to reject it. And that's in the creation story, that's the source of kind of all the consternation and complex drama that has brought us to where we are in the present. It's all rooted in the fact that people are given the choice. We didn't have to do right, and we often don't choose to do right. But God thinks that freedom is more important than forcing us to sort of comply to some vision.
So I think what you're telling me is that it's not very godlike to not give people a choice.
Yeah, that's how I read the Bible.
Yeah. I'm reminded,
And
I
when
told
you
you.
know, and when I think about having to make a decision about whether women have a choice about what happens with their bodies, it is a very moral decision for me. And if I have to make that decision, in any political context, I think choosing to affirm the choice that people have to determine their own, bodily future is in line with what God offers to all of us.
I told you before we started recording, we were getting to know each other just a little bit. I said, I told you I used to read the Bible all the way through every year.
Hmm.
And a lot of it, I did hide in my heart that I might not sin against thee. And so a lot of it comes to mind when I'm having these conversations. And I just keep hearing that echo of that verse of choose you this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, which is in Joshua. And
Hmm.
it's like that presupposes that there was a choice to be made, that
Hmm.
there's always a choice to be made. We get to individually make our choices. And so it's really interesting to hear you talk about, yeah, that's our tradition, that's our faith, that's the God we know, is God's giving us choice.
Yeah.
So the idea of placing ourselves in a position in others' lives where we feel like, no, I can take your choice away. I mean, that if we had a God who removed our choice, then that would make sense. But it doesn't seem to align with the scriptural God, the Southern Baptist God, the Christian God, the God that we know,
Yeah.
who, as you're saying, as you're explaining to us here, is saying, no, I'm going to allow you to choose what you are going to choose for you. I think we have to extend that same courtesy to our fellow human beings. Does that make sense?
It does make sense to me. And again, as I read the biblical story, the incredible thing about the story is the way that grace works, even as humans make choices that are less than perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Peop Even in the stories we have, even the stories of our saints, the stories of the great, mothers and fathers of the tradition, they don't always necessarily make the right choice. but but somehow Hebrews can say that a character like David was a person after God's own heart. Even though if you know David's story, I mean the brother was
Doesn't
all
appear
messed.
to
I mean
be.
he made some bad choices, right?
He did.
Yeah, I just think that at the heart of the story is that sense that God wants to have a real relationship with us. God says, "Look, you might mess up sometimes. I want a real relationship with you. So I'm going to let you choose, and I'm going to be here, and I'm going to, love you." That seems to me that's the story of the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is we've been talking with Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove, and thank you so much for coming on Right to Life and sharing this with us. I have wanted to find a pastor to come on and talk with us about these things, and it is my utter delight to find a Southern Baptist one to come on because of my own tradition. So,
Well, I
thank you
mean,
for doing this.
as I am a pastor, let me just say I have lots of conversations about this issue. That part of being a pastor is you promise not to say everything you hear. So I'm not going to, repeat all that. But what I can say is that I know that what you're talking to people about here on your podcast is something that a lot of people are wrestling with.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate you creating a forum where people who can talk openly about it are talking openly about it, because I know there are a lot of people, probably your listeners, who might not have a place where they can talk about this and hear what others think. So thank you for cultivating this space.
Oh, thank you for that. That was kindness. Thank you. Here in Florida, we are less than 2 weeks from voting day. I'm unsure if we'll be able to get another episode to you before then, but I think if we don't, time spent with a Southern Baptist pastor is a fitting close to this chapter of the conversation about abortion, because that tradition is the root from whence I came. It seems right and good to have come full circle in this way, doesn't it? Anytime I chase wisdom, there's a point when I need to assemble before me all that I've learned and decide my reaction to it. Find the wisdom in it. The thing that is going to inform my steps moving forward. In 9 episodes, we have heard from an OBGYN. She told us that 95% of abortions happen before the first 15 weeks anyway, and that states with restrictive abortion laws now have double the maternal deaths of those without restrictive laws. We heard from an attorney. He told us that this amendment does not remove the legal requirements to get parental consent for minors to have abortions, that it restricts abortion up to the point of fetal viability, and that both that word and the words healthcare provider are clearly defined legal and medical terms, so nobody has to guess about their meanings or interpretations. We heard from a theologian who read to us a doctrinal paper written by multiple evangelical pastors in the 1960s that affirmed the necessity of abortion access for the lives of women. She also shared with us that God allows 66% of fertilized eggs to naturally not result in a live birth, which sure begged the question in my mind of whether God himself is pro-life according to the modern-day life begins at conception requirement. We heard from a pastor who reminded us that the God of both the Bible and Christian tradition gives choice. And that lets me know that God values humans having choices, regardless of whether the options on the table are good or bad. We heard from a woman named Sam, whose story let us know that without abortion, she would have died from her pregnancy. And that death would not only have robbed her 2 existing children and her husband of her and their lives, but it also meant we would not have the life of her 3rd child, who was born 1 year later. We heard from another woman, Emily, whose story let us know that there can be gut-wrenching complications when a woman is pregnant with more than 1 child, and that by choosing abortion for one of hers, she was able to save the life of the other. And that's how we have beautiful, sparkly 13-year-old Harper today. I have said to you multiple times that this show does not exist to tell you how to vote. I have not, and I will not tell you how to vote on Amendment 4. I think that choice is up to you. Your vote is yours. My vote is mine. We have chased wisdom here together. We must now apply discernment toward the information that we've uncovered, and then align that learning with our value, nurture, and protection of life. I have completed that process now. My vote is a vote for life, which is why I will be voting yes on Amendment 4.
You've been listening to Right to Life on the 1C Story Network. If you have a story to share or would like to learn more, please visit righttolifestories.com. This show is brought to you by the generous support of people who value life. To contribute, visit righttolifestories.com or get in touch.
The 1C Story Network, for the love of stories.